How are you doing, FTD News viewers out there? Welcome to this edition of FTD News in History. Now, for this episode, we're going way back to the 1600s, highlighting the Salem witch trials. But before we continue with this episode's story, I want to know, witchcraft, is it real or is it fake? Leave your answers down there. Now, English Protestants of the 1692 Massachusetts Bay Colony, they saw themselves as builders of a new civilization, building a new society from the ground up, but every single corner of this new world that they were establishing for themselves was filled with a lot of physical and spiritual dangers. Just like a deadly virus, the plague of magic had infected pretty much every single colonist, from young to old. Now, while we may never know the total amount of people that were put to death for practicing witchcraft, it's estimated about 185 people across 25 different locations of the colony were put to death. Now, this was just an ocean of finger pointing. Husbands accused their wives, daughters turned on their mothers, nephews snitched on their aunties. The youngest of those accused of being a witch or a wizard was only 5 years old, and the eldest one accused was nearly 80. At the height of this witch hunt going on, one colonist found that there were 20 witches in his family. Now, it all began when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and her friend Abigail Williams began to act very strange, experiencing screaming fits as well as being bitten by an invisible force. And within a few weeks, a number of other young women around Salem began to behave in the same way. There were also members of the Goodwin family that were barking like dogs, making cat sounds, and running in fear from invisible spirits. And when any of them were asked to conduct some sort of religious act like saying a prayer, all hell would break loose. Now, doctors were completely dumbfounded because when they examined these young girls, there were no medical explanations for any of the symptoms that they were showing, as well as there was no actual physical illness that they could diagnose. The only explanation that they could come up with was this was the work of the devil. Now, just a little over 50 years before this, in 1641, idolatry, or the worship of false gods, was established as a major criminal offense, far worse than murder because it involved the final destiny of your soul. And during the Salem witch hunts, the one who led the charge against this new supernatural threat was a young, passionate minister by the name of Cotton Mather. Now, he ignited people's fears with every single ultra superstitious word that would come out of his mouth. Even something like a pile of dirty laundry held some sort of spiritual significance to Cotton Mather. I mean, like, this guy took things to the next level. Like, this wasn't superstition, this was turbostition. A man by the name of Reverend Samuel Parris, which was Elizabeth Parris's father, began conducting prayer services and ordered people in the community to fast in hopes of fighting off these evil spirits. Now, in an effort to dig up the suspected witches in the community, a colonist by the name of John Indian also made a thoroughly disgusting witch cake with ingredients that included rye meal and the suspect's own urine. Now, this counter spell was made to expose additional witches for Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris to identify, because these two young girls were the ringleaders of this whole conspiracy. As a matter of fact, these two young ladies were under constant coercion by Cotton Mather himself, as well as his crew of supernatural investigators, to pinpoint the original source of witchcraft among the colony. Eventually, the girls identified 3 older women as the original source of this. The women included Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good, and a West Indian slave of the Parris family by the name of Tituba. All 3 women were immediately arrested on February 29th of 1692. Yes, February 29th, that's a leap day. Added more fuel to this superstition. Now, while Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were firm in claiming that they were innocent, Tituba, she had a completely different testimony now. She reported that she would see visions of Satan coming towards her in the form of a giant dog. Sometimes he would appear as a giant pig. And now, to take the drama just a little bit further, the slave Tituba, she also spoke of a society of witches that were plotting to take over Salem and the surrounding colonies. So was there really some truth to this whole madness? Now let's answer a couple questions. So what was actually considered a witch back back then? Was it just somebody that worked magic? Was it a devil worshiper? Or was a witch or wizard identified as just an evil person in general? Well, according to European folklore, witches were very wild and mischievous, causing a lot of trouble everywhere they went. They would kidnap babies, they would steal penises from men. Ouch, I'm just cringing just even thinking about that. They would abuse wild dogs, as well as they would attend bloodthirsty ceremonies deep in the woods. They could also walk on their hands and make pregnancies go on for years. Now that was the idea of what a witch was. But those labeled in Salem as witches, they were pretty tame by comparison. To be labeled as a witch in Salem, all one had to do was supposedly put a spell on a drink, or maybe weave a cloth that was a little too well woven, according to other women in the village. Now, what was considered substantial evidence of witchcraft? People all over the colonies couldn't decide what was substantial evidence, but in most of the cases, a free voluntary confession by the person that was suspected to be a witch was proof enough. But you see, many of these confessions came about by torture. And for men like Cotton Mather, the concern was less about killing an innocent person than about allowing a sorceress to remain free to infect others. Tituba's testimony of this witch conspiracy set people's imaginations on fire. Now, after about 20 people were put to death during the Salem witch trials, a colonist by the name of Thomas Brattle wrote a letter criticizing the witch trials. Even Cotton Mather himself was a little bit troubled by one of the executions. This execution was of a man by the name of George Burroughs, kept uttering the Lord's Prayer over and over again just before he was hanged. So the thoughts that were going through his mind was, had they been wrong? Are they being too severe with this whole thing? What if they made a mistake? A little bit too late to be second guessing yourself now. People have died already. Now, Thomas Brattle's letter made a huge impression on then Governor Phipps, who commanded that magical and intangible evidence would no longer be allowed in charging and trying people for witchcraft. Ultimately, the witchcraft court was disbanded, and Cotton Mather returned to a former field of study that he was pursuing, the field of medicine. Now, the crucible has been portrayed in many plays and movies over the years. One of the most notable ones is the movie Crucible, made in 1996, starring Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder. Let me tell you, if you watch this movie, like, the acting is so convincing, and especially how it ends, it will piss you off. So I recommend that movie for you guys that want to find out more about the Salem witch trials. That does it for this episode for News in History. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you want to check out some other videos, you can check them out on the end screen that is coming up. And stay tuned each and every weekend for more News in History videos, as well as throughout the week for your daily news. I'm Leroy Kenton, and I'll see you guys real soon.